France. Late summer, 1944. The hedgerows have burned away in places, leaving open fields scarred by treads and shrapnel. The air smells of diesel and scorched earth. Somewhere beyond a low ridge, a German Panther tank moves laterally across the horizon, a dark silhouette against pale sky. Distance, nearly 2,000 yards. Wind from the west, gusting at 12 miles per hour. The gunner inside an American M4 Sherman squints through his periscope, hand steady on the traverse wheel. His loader has already slammed a 76mm armor-piercing round into the breech. The commander says nothing. Everyone knows the odds. At this range, with a moving target and crosswind, the shot is nearly impossible. The gunner exhales slowly. He adjusts for elevation. Then windage. One click left. Another. The Panther continues its crawl, unaware. The gunner's finger hovers over the trigger. He doesn't pray. He calculates. And then he fires. By the summer of 1944, tank warfare had evolved into a brutal science of range, armor, and angle. The introduction of the German Panther tank in 1943 had fundamentally changed the calculus of armored engagement on the Western Front. With frontal armor nearly 80 millimeters thick and sloped at 55 degrees, the Panther could deflect most Allied tank rounds at typical combat distances. Its 75mm KW K-42 L-70 gun possessed a muzzle velocity exceeding 3,000 feet per second, capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. American and British tank crews quickly learned a grim lesson. Frontally, at medium range, the Panther was nearly invincible. Doctrine shifted accordingly. Tank destroyers were prioritized for anti-armor roles. Shermans were instructed to flank, to use terrain, to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. The standard M4 Sherman, armed with a 75mm gun, could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor beyond 500 yards. Even the upgraded 76mm gun, introduced in mid-1944, struggled at longer ranges. The tactical implication was clear. Close the distance, maneuver, and hope for a side or rear shot. Long-range duels favored the Germans. Yet battles do not always permit ideal conditions. In the open farmland of Normandy and the rolling plains beyond, concealment was sparse. Tank engagements frequently occurred at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, where precision became as critical as firepower. American tank crews were trained in gunnery at Fort Knox and armored schools across the United States, where they practiced on static targets at known ranges. Real combat introduced variables no training range could replicate: moving targets, uneven terrain, smoke, adrenaline, and wind. Especially wind. A crosswind of even 10 miles per hour could deflect a 76mm shell by several feet at 1,500 yards. At 2,000 yards, the margin of error became almost impossibly narrow. The gunner had to account not only for bullet drop and target speed, but also for lateral drift caused by wind pressure on the spinning projectile. This required intuition as much as mathematics, a feel for the weapon that came only from experience. Most gunners never developed it. Most never had the chance. Range-finding in a moving Sherman was an imprecise art. The M4's periscopic gun sight offered limited magnification and a narrow field of view. There was no laser rangefinder, no ballistic computer. The gunner relied on visual estimation, confirmed by the tank commander's observation and occasionally by bracketing fire, shooting over, then under, then adjusting. But bracketing revealed your position and wasted ammunition. In a duel with a Panther, you rarely got more than one chance. German optics were superior. Zeiss lenses provided clarity and magnification that American tankers envied. Panther gunners could identify and engage targets at ranges where Shermans were still trying to confirm what they were looking at. This asymmetry forced American crews to adopt cunning over capability. They used defied positions, firing from hull-down postures where only the turret was exposed. They coordinated with infantry and artillery to suppress enemy armor before closing in. And when circumstances demanded a long-range shot, they relied on the rare few gunners who possessed an almost supernatural ability to read distance, wind, and motion simultaneously. Environmental conditions in late 1944 were unforgiving. August heat turned tank interiors into ovens, distorting vision through the periscope with heat shimmer. Dust kicked up by advancing columns obscured targets and clogged optics. Rain turned fields into mud, slowing movement and reducing visibility. And always there was wind, unpredictable, shifting, invisible but deadly in its effect on ballistics. A skilled gunner learned to watch for visual cues, the bend of grass, the drift of smoke, the flutter of cloth on a distant structure. He learned to convert these observations into mental adjustments, adding or subtracting mils of deflection without conscious thought. This was not taught in manuals. It was developed through repetition, failure, and survival. By the time the Allied armored divisions reached the German border in autumn 1944, a small percentage of gunners had become exceptional. They were the ones called upon when the impossible shot was necessary. They were the ones who understood that mathematics alone could not account for war. Instinct mattered. And on one particular afternoon, in a field outside a town whose name has faded from most records, one of those gunners prepared to prove it. The gunner's name has been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately omitted from official records. What remains is the account itself, passed through after-action reports and the memories of his crew. He was likely in his early 20s, a product of American tank training, schools where accuracy was emphasized over speed. Unlike infantry marksmen who fired individual rifles, a tank gunner controlled a weapon system weighing 30 tons, stabilized only by the skill of his driver and the steadiness of his own hand. Every movement of the traverse and elevation wheels translated into the rotation of a 10-foot gun tube. At 2,000 yards, a single degree of error meant missing by dozens of feet. The psychological pressure was immense. A missed shot revealed your position. A second shot gave the enemy time to respond. And if that enemy was a Panther, response meant death. In mils, each representing roughly 3 feet of deflection at 1,000 yards. At 2,000 yards, the margin for error shrank to fractions of a mil. One click too many, and the shell sailed wide. One click too few, and it passed harmlessly behind the target. This engagement did not occur in isolation. By late summer 1944, Allied armored columns were pushing eastward across France, encountering stiffening German resistance as they neared the pre-war border. Panther tanks, once deployed in massed formations, were now dispersed in small groups, often dug in or operating as mobile reserves to counterattack breakthroughs. Their role had shifted from offensive spearhead to defensive anchor. German commanders positioned Panthers on high ground or at choke points, leveraging their superior range and armor to blunt Allied advances. American tank platoons, aware of this tactic, moved cautiously. They employed reconnaissance elements, jeeps, half-tracks, and dismounted infantry to identify enemy positions before committing armor. When a Panther was spotted, standard doctrine called for artillery or air support. Direct engagement was avoided unless unavoidable. But support was not always available. Communication delays, weather, or the chaos of fluid combat often left tank crews to solve their own problems. In this instance, the Sherman crew found themselves observing a Panther moving across open ground, likely repositioning between defensive positions. The distance was extreme, the opportunity fleeting. Engaging risked revealing their position. Not engaging allowed the Panther to reach a more advantageous location. The commander made the call. The gunner would take the shot. The 76mm M1A1 gun represented the best anti-armor weapon available to American medium tanks in 1944. Yet, it remained a compromise. Introduced as an upgrade to the underpowered 75mm, it offered improved penetration. Ration but still fell short of the Panther's gun in both velocity and stopping power. The M62 armor-piercing round could penetrate roughly 4 inches of vertical armor at 1,000 yards, sufficient against most German tanks, but marginal against the Panther's sloped frontal plate. At 2,000 yards, penetration dropped below 3 inches. This meant that even a perfect hit on the Panther's front might not result in a kill. The gunner had to aim for weak points, the lower hull, the turret ring, or ideally, the side armor. But a moving target at extreme range rarely offered such precision. The shot would be aimed at center mass, trusting velocity and angle to do the rest. The gun itself was a precision instrument, but one subject to wear and temperature. Repeated firing eroded the rifling, reducing accuracy. Heat expansion altered the barrel's geometry. The gunner had to know his weapon intimately, how many rounds had been fired, whether the barrel was hot, whether the recoil mechanism was functioning smoothly. Any deviation from optimal condition multiplied the difficulty of an already nearly impossible shot. Inside the Panther, the crew was likely unaware they were being observed. German tank doctrine emphasized mobility and situational awareness. But at 2,000 yards, even excellent optics struggled to detect a hull-down Sherman partially concealed by terrain or foliage. The Panther's commander would have been scanning for threats, but his attention was divided, navigating the route, communicating with other units, monitoring fuel and ammunition. The driver focused on terrain, avoiding obstacles and maintaining speed. The gunner, unless alerted, would not have been actively searching for targets at extreme range. The Panther's movement, steady, lateral, perhaps 15 miles per hour, suggested confidence. They were not evading. They were relocating. This psychological advantage belonged to the Americans. Surprise, when combined with precision, could overcome material inferiority, but only if the shot connected. A miss would alert the Panther. German crews were trained to react instantly. Halt, traverse, fire. The Panther's gun could range the Sherman within seconds. If the first American shot failed, there would likely not be a second. Wind estimation was the final, most uncertain variable. The gunner could see the wind's effects, grass bending, dust drifting, but translating observation into numerical deflection required judgment honed by experience. He likely used a mental shortcut. For every 5 miles per hour of crosswind, add or subtract 1 mil of deflection per 1,000 yards. At 12 miles per hour and 2,000 yards, that meant approximately 5 mils of windage. But was the wind truly 12 miles per hour? Was it consistent across the entire trajectory, or gusting? Was it perpendicular to the line of fire, or at an angle? Each uncertainty compounded. The gunner made his best estimate. He cranked the traverse wheel. The reticle shifted left. He rechecked the range. Elevation was set. The Panther continued moving. He calculated lead. How far ahead of the target to aim to account for its motion during the shell's flight time? At 2,000 yards, flight time was roughly 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, A tank moving 15 miles per hour traveled 65 feet. He adjusted again. The reticle settled on empty air, several tank lengths ahead of the Panther. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. But the mathematics demanded it. He trusted the calculation, and he fired. The gun roared. The entire Sherman rocked backward on its suspension, absorbing 30 tons of recoil energy. Inside the turret, the gunner was momentarily blinded by the muzzle flash reflecting off his periscope. Acrid smoke filled the fighting compartment. The loader immediately broke open another shell crate, preparing for a follow-up shot. The commander pressed his eyes against his vision blocks, scanning desperately for impact. At 2,000 yards, it would take nearly 3 seconds for the shell to arrive. 3 seconds is an eternity in combat. The Panther continued moving, oblivious. The German crew had not yet registered the distant crack of the Sherman's gun, or if they had not identified it as a threat. The shell arced through the air, spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, shedding velocity to wind resistance and gravity. It descended along a parabolic curve, drifting laterally as the crosswind pressed against its mass. The gunner held his breath. He could not see the shell. No one could. He could only wait and hope that his calculations had accounted for every variable, that his experience had filled in the gaps left by mathematics. Then, impact. The shell struck the Panther's right side, just below the turret ring. At that angle, the sloped armor offered less protection. The M62 round punched through the 40mm side plate and detonated inside the crew compartment. A flash of orange flame erupted from the impact point, followed by a secondary explosion as onboard ammunition cooked off. The Panther lurched to a halt, black smoke pouring from hatches and vision ports. The turret did not traverse. There was no return fire. For a moment, the Sherman crew sat in stunned silence. The loader spoke first, a single word of disbelief. The commander confirmed through his periscope. Hit. Definite hit. Target destroyed. The gunner leaned back from his sight, exhaling for what felt like the first time in minutes. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system in the aftermath of absolute focus. He had made the shot. Against probability, against doctrine, against every reasonable expectation, he had killed a Panther at 2,000 yards with a single round. The battlefield did not pause to acknowledge the feat. Other tanks in the platoon were already moving. G4 forward, capitalizing on the sudden opening. Infantry advanced under the cover of smoke and suppressing fire. The destroyed Panther sat motionless, a burning monument to precision and luck in equal measure. German forces in the area, alerted by the explosion, began repositioning. The element of surprise was gone. The Sherman crew knew they had seconds, perhaps a minute, before enemy artillery or another tank located them. The commander ordered the driver to reverse into defilade, relocating before counter-battery fire arrived. As the Sherman pulled back, the gunner took one last look through his periscope at the smoking wreck in the distance. He did not celebrate. There was no time. There was only the next target, the next calculation, the next impossible shot that might be demanded of him. But for this one moment, he had done something extraordinary. He had reduced chaos to numbers, and the numbers had held. The crew's reaction was a mixture of relief and residual tension. The loader clapped the gunner on the shoulder, a brief acknowledgement of skill or fortune. Neither man was certain which. The driver, focused on maneuvering the Sherman into a concealed position, said nothing but allowed himself a slight grin. The commander, responsible for maintaining tactical awareness, was already calling in the kill over the radio, alerting adjacent units that the Panther threat had been neutralized. His voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the shock he felt. He had ordered the shot expecting failure, expecting to immediately displace and evade. Instead, they had achieved a result that would be discussed in after-action reports and debriefing sessions for weeks to come. The gunner remained silent. He was replaying the shot in his mind, analyzing each step, each adjustment. Had he overestimated the wind? Had he added too much lead? The fact that the shot connected suggested his calculations were correct, but the margin for error had been so narrow that even a minor mistake should have resulted in a miss. Perhaps the wind had gusted at precisely the right moment. Perhaps the Panther had slowed slightly just before impact. Or perhaps, for once, everything had aligned perfectly. German response was immediate, but disorganized. The Panther had been operating semi-independently, and its sudden destruction created confusion among nearby units. Radio chatter, later intercepted and translated, revealed that German commanders initially suspected artillery or air attack. The idea that a Sherman had scored a direct hit at extreme range was not seriously considered. This misattribution bought the American unit precious time. By the time German forces identified the actual threat axis and began maneuvering to counter it, the Sherman platoon had already shifted positions and consolidated with supporting infantry. The destroyed Panther became a landmark for subsequent operations, a reference point on tactical maps. American reconnaissance teams examined the wreck later that day, noting the entry point of the armor-piercing round and the catastrophic internal damage it had caused. The crew had not survived. The impact had killed or incapacitated them instantly, and the subsequent ammunition fire had made the interior uninhabitable. It was a clean kill, the kind that tankers hoped for and rarely achieved against an opponent as formidable as the Panther. The broader tactical situation shifted subtly in the hours following the engagement. German forces, already cautious about exposing their armor to long-range fire, became more so. Panthers withdrew further from forward positions, operating only with extensive infantry screening and anti-tank gun support. This increased caution slowed their effectiveness as mobile counterattack forces, allowing Allied units to exploit breakthroughs more aggressively. The psychological impact on both sides was difficult to quantify, but undeniable. American tank crews, who had operated under the assumption that engaging Panthers beyond 1,000 yards was suicidal, began to reconsider. Not every crew possessed a gunner capable of such a shot, but the mere possibility altered decision-making. Commanders were slightly more willing to authorize long-range engagements when conditions favored them. German crews, conversely, lost a degree of the invincibility they had come to rely upon. If a Sherman could kill a Panther at 2,000 yards, then nowhere was truly safe. The material superiority of the Panther remained unchanged, but the confidence it inspired had been fractured. And in armored warfare, confidence was often as decisive as armor thickness. The immediate aftermath of the engagement saw the Sherman crew pulled from the line for debriefing. This was not standard procedure for a single tank kill, but the circumstances demanded documentation. Intelligence officers wanted details: exact range, wind conditions, ammunition type, number of rounds fired, time of day, target aspect. The gunner answered methodically, reconstructing his thought process for men who had never sat in a tank turret under fire. They asked if he had used a specific formula for windage calculation. He explained that it was intuition informed by experience, a field developed over months of gunnery practice and combat. They asked if the technique could be taught. He was uncertain. Some gunners developed the skill naturally. Others never did, no matter how much training they received. The officers nodded, taking notes. They were already considering how to incorporate extreme-range gunnery into updated training protocols, though they recognized that replicating battlefield conditions in a controlled environment was nearly impossible. What worked in desperation under fire might fail completely on a peacetime range. Still, the engagement proved that the 76mm gun, properly employed, could threaten even the most formidable German armor at distances previously thought prohibitive. The crew returned to their unit with a reputation that preceded them. Other tankers regarded them with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Some believed the shot had been pure luck, a statistical anomaly that happened once in 10,000 attempts. Others saw it as validation of American gunnery training, proof that skill could overcome material disadvantage. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. The gunner had made correct calculations and executed them flawlessly, but he had also benefited from circumstances beyond his control. Steady wind, clear visibility, a target moving in a predictable pattern, and perhaps most importantly, the absence of German countermeasures during the critical seconds before impact. Change any one variable, and the shot would have missed. The gunner himself refused to claim exceptional skill. When pressed by his platoon leader, he stated simply that he had done his job. He had been trained to engage targets at range. He had identified the target, calculated the solution, and fired. The result was success, but it could just as easily have been failure. He did not dwell on it. There would be other targets, other calculations, other moments where mathematics and instinct would determine whether he lived or died. Recognition came slowly and bureaucratically. The engagement was noted in the unit's daily operations log, then forwarded up the chain of command as part of routine combat reporting. Somewhere in divisional headquarters, an analyst flagged it as noteworthy. A recommendation for commendation was drafted, then lost in the paperwork shuffle of an army managing hundreds of thousands of personnel across multiple fronts. By the time it resurfaced weeks later, the crew had been rotated out of the line for maintenance, and the urgency of the moment had faded. The gunner eventually received a commendation for exceptional gunnery performance under combat conditions, a generic citation that could have applied to 100 different actions. Their way. Snow medal ceremony. No photograph. No public acknowledgement. This was typical of the war's later stages, when individual heroism was subsumed into the vast machinery of industrial conflict. The gunner did not mind. He had not fired for recognition. He had fired because the target was there, and eliminating it was necessary. The rest was simply noise. The tactical lessons drawn from the engagement rippled through armored training programs in the months that followed. Gunnery instructors at Fort Knox and Aberdeen Proving Ground received updated guidance emphasizing extreme-range marksmanship. New firing tables were distributed, incorporating more detailed windage calculations and environmental variables. Training scenarios began including exercises at 1,500 to 2,000 yards, forcing gunners to develop skills that had previously been considered impractical. The results were mixed. Some gunners adapted, developing the necessary feel for long-range shooting. Others struggled, unable to reconcile mathematical precision with battlefield chaos. The consensus among training cadre was that extreme-range gunnery could not be universally taught. It was a specialization suited to certain individuals with particular aptitudes. Units began informally identifying their best long-range shooters, assigning them to lead tanks in reconnaissance or overwatch roles where such skills might prove decisive. This informal specialization was never codified in doctrine, but it influenced how platoon leaders employed their assets for the remainder of the war. German responses to the incident insofar as they could be determined, focused on enhancing protective measures rather than acknowledging vulnerabilities. Panther crews were instructed to minimize lateral movement across open ground, to increase speed when relocation was necessary, and to operate only with infantry and artillery support in contested areas. Intelligence reports suggested that some German tank commanders became more reluctant to expose their vehicles at extended ranges, preferring close-quarters engagements. That's where armor superiority was decisive. This shift, however subtle, played into Allied strengths. American combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, armor, and artillery, were most effective at close range where coordination was easier and German long-range advantages were negated. By forcing Panthers into closer engagements, the Allies reduced the material disparity that had defined armored combat since 1943. The one shot at 2,000 yards had not changed the fundamental balance of armored warfare, but it had contributed to a gradual erosion of German tactical confidence. The destroyed Panther itself became an object of study. Ordnance teams examined the penetration hole, measuring depth and angle to assess the effectiveness of the M62 round against sloped armor. Metallurgists analyzed fragments of the armor plate, confirming that German manufacturing quality remained high despite resource shortages. The internal damage was catastrophic, proof that even a single penetrating hit could destroy a tank if it struck a critical area. Photographs of the wreck were included in intelligence bulletins distributed to tank units, used to illustrate vulnerable points on the Panther's hull and turret. These images, combined with the account of the engagement, contributed to a slowly evolving understanding that the Panther, while formidable, was not invincible. American tank crews began to internalize this lesson. They remained respectful of the Panther's capabilities, but the paralyzing fear that had characterized early encounters diminished. Confidence grew incrementally, built on engagements like this one, where skill and circumstance combined to overcome technological disadvantage. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, the psychological balance had shifted. The Panther was still dangerous, but it was no longer mythic. The shot at 2,000 yards, dures not because it was typical, but because it was exceptional. A convergence of training, instinct, and circumstance that illuminated what was possible when human skill met the extreme demands of mechanized warfare. It represented a moment where the individual mattered within a conflict increasingly defined by mass production and industrial scale. The gunner, whose name history has misplaced or never recorded, achieved something that transcended tactical significance. He demonstrated that technology alone did not determine outcomes, that the human element, judgment, experience, the ability to synthesize chaos into coherent action, remained decisive even in an age of steel and explosives. This engagement also revealed the paradox at the heart of armored warfare. Superiority in equipment created advantages, but those advantages could be negated by proficiency and resolve. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman by nearly every measurable standard, yet it burned just the same when struck precisely in a vulnerable location. The lesson was humbling for both sides. For the Germans, it underscored that technological edge could not compensate for numerical inferiority and strategic exhaustion. For the Americans, it confirmed that courage and competence could bridge material gaps, at least temporarily, at least when circumstances aligned. In the decades since, military theorists have studied this and similar engagements to understand the limits of predictability in combat. Gunnery can be taught, ballistics can be calculated, but the moment when a young man peers through a narrow periscope, adjusts for wind he cannot see, and fires at a target nearly a mile away, that moment resists formalization. It belongs to the realm of human performance under pressure, where preparation meets improvisation, where mathematics yields to something less quantifiable, but no less real. The shot connected because the gunner believed it could, because he trusted his training enough to attempt the improbable. And when the shell found its mark, it affirmed a truth as old as warfare itself. That skill, when tested at the edge of possibility, sometimes transcends limitation. The Panther burned. The war continued. But for one gunner, one crew, one impossible calculation held against the wind and distance and doubt, that was enough.